Hey there, my name's Curtis Lucas and you're watching Empire Building. Remember back in 2021 when Bitcoin had just broken out into a new all-time high, passing $20,000 finally. Something those of us who were already invested had been waiting for a very long time to see. Bitcoin came running out of the gates like a raging bull, tearing apart everything in its path. Anyone who chose to stand in front of that got torn to shreds. Bitcoin seemed unstoppable. The mainstream media was finally beginning to see its relevance, its importance, and its legitimacy. It truly seemed unstoppable. But of course, all of that would prove to be unsustainable. And by the time 2022 rolled along, things looked quite a bit different. Now that brings us to today. We've been bleeding for 3 months, pretty much non-stop, which rightfully so has led many to declare it a bear market. I mean, who can blame them? Bitcoin has fallen over 50% from its most recent all-time highs. So the big question weighing on many people's minds is, are we facing another multi-year bear market? That's the question we're going to talk about in this video. Obviously, periods like this is nothing any long investor wants to live through. We all would like to believe that we're smart enough to identify the signals and get out at the top. But as many of us have discovered, that is easier said than done. And even if you do successfully sell the top, staying out long enough to buy the supposed bottom is fundamentally near impossible, especially if you believe in the technology. You will view this as far undervalued long before we reach levels like this. And the reason for that is behavior that we are witnessing today is not the behavior of a rational market. Irrational markets are impossible to predict. What that means is predicting the top is just as difficult as predicting the bottom. But bear markets are incredibly important for those long-term investors. Without bear markets, it's nearly impossible for any long-term investor to be able to build a position of any substantial size without taking on significant risk by buying large sums all at once. For those who are dollar cost averaging, bear markets are ideal and entirely necessary for the long-term success of that investment thesis. The best time to be building a position is when everyone else thinks it's run its course. The reality is this is still early days. The fact that Bitcoin can still draw down this significantly is evidence of that. And the fact that oppressive regimes around the world are worried about it enough that they're concerned and are actively trying to ban it within their borders should tell you all you need to know about its power and influence. Some of these nations feel threatened by it, but I'm not going to veer off into those topics in this video. I want to focus on that question. Is this a bear market? And if it is, what do we do about it? So like I mentioned, we can see from the very, very top to the very, very bottom, Bitcoin has lost just over 50% of its value, dropping 52.3% as of earlier this morning's price action, which bottomed out at $33,000 or just below that level. Now, obviously, this is not something that I ever expected. Obviously not. Those of us, everyone has been drawing lines all over this chart for the last 3 months. Everybody trying to predict where the floor is going to be. And everybody got it wrong, which has obviously brought many to the realization that technical analysis is at best for entertainment purposes only. Witnessing what we just experienced here has certainly reprogrammed some of our behavior. And it's something that we're going to have to be careful in the future. But again, that's an important topic for some future videos. But for now, I want to try to focus on answering this question. Is this a bear market? Obviously, with a 50% drawdown, there's no question about it. You can definitely define this as a bear market, even for Bitcoin. The fact of the matter is we have broken market structure, at least to some degree. So you could certainly make the argument that we've been in this bear market for 3 months now. But does that mean we're going to be facing a longer term 6 to 12 or 18 months of suppressed price action? Is it going to take another 2 or 3 years for Bitcoin to return to those all-time highs? And this is where my opinion might differ more than most. But before we get into that, I do have to remind you all that my strategy is not dependent on whether or not we are in a bull market or a bear market. My strategy from here on out is to go back to what worked in the first place. There is a very simple strategy for bear markets, and that is to just buy little by little and hold for the long term. It's a boring strategy, and it works. We should be so lucky to have a bear market that lasts another 3 years. Imagine how much you could accumulate during that time, so long as nobody is forcing you to sell. Holding positions in margin or short-term call options is probably not the best strategy at a time like this. But buying little by little and holding for the long term, as far as I'm concerned, has a much lower chance of not succeeding. But I do have one more case to make. One more, shall we say, Hail Mary pass. On this chart, I'm using a volume profile. This tool basically highlights the amount of Bitcoin that had changed hands at what prices. And what I found interesting about this is the price that we dropped to today lands us right in the range of the maximum volume profile. The most amount of Bitcoin traded hands at these prices. And this goes for the entire bull market ever since we broke out of those former all-time highs. So as far as I'm concerned, this is our last stand. And again, I'm not making a market prediction that this is where Bitcoin bottoms. But I am struggling with this idea that we're going to enter into some kind of a prolonged bear market. And I'm not just talking about Bitcoin here. Obviously, a lot of this stems from all the market volatility and uncertainty that's come out of the broader markets. With the Fed raising rates in a high interest rate environment, this is not a situation we've found ourselves in before. This is why the market is having such a hard time digesting this, that doesn't know what it means. So it's assuming the worst. And as I've mentioned before, I believe that there was a market incentive to drive prices down the way that they have. Although I had massively underestimated the effect that it would have. The reaction in these markets goes well beyond anything that I would consider rational. The fact of the matter is the NASDAQ Composite Index, as of this morning, had fallen a total of 19% from its most recent all-time highs, all in just a couple of months. That is an extremely aggressive correction. Now, obviously, this market has been burning hot for some time, and we all knew that a correction was due. It's just who really wants to try and time this thing? Time and time again, we've had scares that made people think this was the top. And as of right now, at least we recently bottomed at those very levels. But when you look at this on its surface, when you look at the motivations behind it, obviously the worst case scenario that the market seems to be attempting to price in is that the Federal Reserve raising interest rates will induce a market recession. So they're trying to preemptively adjust those valuations. But it's pure speculation. The fact of the matter is, we don't know exactly what's going to happen next. People keep forgetting that the rules have changed. The problem is, these markets are burdened with knowledge. They're burdened with past performance indicators. No different than our inability to time the top of this market. Everyone thought Bitcoin was going higher because of past performances. As of right now, the economy has shown very little signs that we're headed for a recession. The factors that drove inflation to levels that they were in previous instances where the Fed responded by raising interest rates to combat inflation. Those market factors are not what exists today. So simply assuming that the Federal Reserve raising interest rates by 1.5% over the course of approximately 1 year is going to induce some sort of massive recession is completely irrational. There is no way, in my opinion, that the Federal Reserve would take that course of action. Nobody wants to be responsible for that. Nobody wants to be in power when that happens. So they're going to do everything in their power to prevent that from happening. And the reality is they raised interest rates to 18% the last time inflation reached these levels. And again, inflation reached these levels for a very different reason back in the early 80s. There is a ton of information I could get into on this, and I don't have time to cover it all in this video, but as this plays out, we'll talk some more about this and more of my thoughts on really what's driving this and what we could realistically expect in terms of economic responses to these kinds of macroeconomic and policy decisions. The Federal Reserve is meeting again this week, and they will announce what their rate hike plan is going forward. My guess is, regardless of whatever they announce, the market will respond favorably, even if it turns out to be 4 rate hikes this year, which I don't think it will be. Because no matter what it ends up being, it will finally provide certainty. And the market likes certainty. It doesn't know how to digest uncertainty. So it always assumes an absolute worst case scenario. And the fact of the matter is, a vast majority of the selling that actually occurs is not a measured response to the information that's available. It's simply a panic sell. Sentiment is a pendulum. It doesn't swing and then stop at fair value. It overshoots and then swings the other way. Now, that does not mean that we can't go lower. I do think that there's at least a strong possibility that as early as tomorrow, and it probably, if it does happen, it probably will be tomorrow, that we retest the bottom we just made this morning. We still have another day of trading before the Fed makes its announcement, so I do think we're going to see some more volatility as the market continues to digest this lack of information. A lot of people are still very, very scared and barely able to hold down their lunches at this point. The NASDAQ may have dropped 19%, but as we are all painfully aware, many of the stocks have fallen far more than that. Many in excess of 50% from their all-time highs. And as far as I'm concerned, I see this as one of those rare opportunities that come around maybe once every 2 or 3 years. The last time the RSI for the NASDAQ sold off this much was the coronavirus crash in 2020. And prior to that, lo and behold, the last taper tantrum that the market suffered back in 2018. The Federal Reserve came out and reversed their stance, decided not to raise rates after all. And we witnessed another massive rally. So, like I said, I don't know. I have a crystal ball. It's not going to tell me what's going to happen next. But based on my observations and the confusion that I've had witnessing all of this play out, I just don't quite understand what the market is truly expecting to happen next. As far as I'm concerned, the worst case is we're going to see some slowed growth for a period of time. But innovation is still going to continue happening. The amount of investment pouring into Bitcoin and blockchain and cryptocurrency and all of this technology is going to continue. The businesses built on top of this entirely new sector are growing rapidly. This is not suddenly going to stop. In fact, it accelerates during bear markets. All of these companies have raised a lot of capital. Bitcoin mining companies have raised a ton of money, and they have a lot of these miners that they have placed those orders for that have long-term delivery schedules. They have a lot of building to do. if this does turn out to be a prolonged bear market, that is probably the best thing that could be happening right now. It gives these companies time to position themselves. There's a whole bunch more to talk about with regards to that topic as well, but again, I've got a lot of videos I've got planned over the next little while. I may have to do some of those in more of a candid style. Not going to be able to do a whole lot in the studio necessarily, but stay tuned. I'm going to try and pump out a whole bunch of content over the next couple of weeks as this entire story plays itself out. So that's it for this one. Now let's get back to empire building.